Section 13 of Psychology of the Unconscious by Carl Jung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 13, Chapter 3, The Transformation of the Libido, a Possible Source of Primitive Human Discoveries. In the following pages, I will endeavor to picture a concrete example of the transition of the libido. I once treated a patient who suffered from a depressive catatonic condition. The case was one of only a slight introversion psychosis, therefore the existence of many hysterical features was not surprising. In the beginning of the analytic treatment, while telling of a very painful occurrence, she fell into a hysterical, dreamy state in which she showed all signs of sexual excitement. For obvious reasons, she lost the knowledge of my presence during this condition. The excitement led to a masturbative act, frictio femorum. This act was accompanied by a peculiar gesture. She made a very violent rotary motion with the forefinger of the left hand on the left temple, as if she were boring a hole there. Afterwards there was complete amnesia for what had happened, and there was nothing to be learned about the queer gesture with her hand. Although this act can easily be likened to a boring into the mouth, nose, or ear, now transferred to the temple, it belongs in the territory of infantile ludus sexualis. To the preliminary exercise preparatory to sexual activity. Without really understanding it, this gesture nevertheless seemed very important to me. Many weeks later, I had an opportunity to speak to the patient's mother, and from her I learned that her daughter had been a very exceptional child. When only 2 years old, she would sit with her back to an open cupboard door for hours and rhythmically beat her head against the door, to the distraction of the household. A little later, instead of playing as other children, she began to bore a hole with her finger in the plaster of the wall of the house. She did this with little turning and scraping movements, and kept herself busy at this occupation for hours. She was a complete puzzle to her parents. From her 4th year, she practiced onanism. It is evident that in this early infantile activity, the preliminary stage of the later trouble may be found. The especially remarkable features in this case are, first, that the child did not carry out the action on its own body, and secondly, the assiduity with which it carried on the action. One is tempted to bring these two facts into a causal relationship, and to say, because the child does not accomplish this action on her own body, perhaps that is the reason of the assiduity, for by boring into the wall she never arrives at the same satisfaction as if she executed the activity onanistically on her own body. The very evident onanistic boring of the patient can be traced back to a very early stage of childhood, which is prior to the period of local onanism. That time is still psychologically very obscure, because individual reproductions and memories are lacking to a great extent, the same as among animals. The race, characteristics, manner of life predominate during the entire life of the animal, whereas among men the individual character asserts itself over the race type. Granting the correctness of this remark, we are struck with the apparently wholly incomprehensible individual activity of this child at this early age. We learn from her later life history that her development, which is, as is always the case, intimately interwoven with parallel external events, has led to that mental disturbance which is especially well known on account of its individuality and the originality of its productions, that is, dementia praecox. The peculiarity of this disturbance, as we have pointed out above, depends upon the predominance of the fantastic form of thought of the infantile in general. From this type of thinking proceed all those numerous contacts with mythological products, and that which we consider as original and holy, individual creations, are very often creations which are comparable with nothing but those of antiquity. I believe that this comparison can be applied to all formations of this remarkable illness, and perhaps also to this special symptom of boring. We have already seen that the onanistic boring of the patient dated from a very early stage of childhood, that is to say, it was reproduced from that period of the past. The sick woman fell back for the first time into the early onanism only after she had been married many years, and following the death of her child, with whom she had identified herself through an overindulgent love. When the child died, the still healthy mother was overcome by early infantile symptoms in the form of scarcely concealed fits of masturbation, which were associated with this very act of boring. As already observed, the primary boring appeared at a time which preceded the infantile onanism localized in the genitals. This fact is of significance in so far as this boring differs thereby from a similar later practice, which appeared after the genital onanism. The later bad habits represent, as a rule, a substitution for repressed genital masturbation, or for an attempt in this direction. As such, these habits, finger-sucking, biting the nails, picking at things, boring into the ears and nose, etc., may persist far into adult life as regular symptoms of a repressed amount of libido. As has already been shown above, the libido in youthful individuals at first manifests itself in the nutritional zone, when food is taken in the act of suckling, with rhythmic movements, and with every sign of satisfaction. With the growth of the individual and the development of his organs, the libido creates for itself new avenues to supply its need of activity and satisfaction. The primary model of rhythmic activity, producing pleasure and satisfaction, must now be transferred to the zone of other functions, with sexuality as its final goal. A considerable part of the hunger libido is transferred into the sexual libido. This transition does not take place suddenly at the time of puberty, as is generally supposed, but very gradually in the course of the greater part of childhood. The libido can free itself only with difficulty and very slowly from that which is peculiar to the function of nutrition, in order to enter into the peculiarity of the sexual function. Two periods are to be distinguished in this state of transition, so far as I can judge: the epoch of suckling and the epoch of the displaced rhythmic activity. Suckling still belongs to the function of nutrition, but passes beyond it, however, in that it is no longer the function of nutrition, but rhythmic activity, with pleasure and satisfaction as a goal, without the taking of nourishment. Here the hand enters as an auxiliary organ. In the period of the displaced rhythmic activity, the hand appears still more clearly as an auxiliary organ. The gaining of pleasure leaves the mouth zone and turns to other regions. The possibilities are now many. As a rule, other openings of the body become the objects of the libido interest, then the skin and special portions of that. The activity expressed in these parts, which can appear as rubbing, boring, picking, and so on, follows a certain rhythm, and serves to produce pleasure. After longer or shorter tarryings of the libido at these stations, it passes onward until it reaches the sexual zone, and there for the first time can be occasion for the beginning of onanistic attempts. In its migration, the libido takes more than a little of the function of nutrition with it into the sexual zone, which readily accounts for the numerous and innate correlations between the functions of nutrition and sexuality. If after the occupation of the sexual zone an obstacle arises against the present form of application of the libido, then there occurs, according to the well-known laws, a regression to the nearest station lying behind to the two above-mentioned periods. It is now of special importance that the epoch of the displaced rhythmic activity coincides in a general way with the time of the development of the mind and of speech. I might designate the period from birth until the occupation of the sexual zone as the pre-sexual stage of development. This generally occurs between the third and fifth year, and is comparable to the chrysalis stage in butterflies. It is distinguished by the irregular commingling of the elements of nutrition and of sexual functions. Certain regressions follow directly back to the pre-sexual stage, and judging from my experience, this seems to be the rule in the regression of dementia praecox. I will give two brief examples. One case concerns a young girl who developed a catatonic state during her engagement. When she saw me for the first time, she came up suddenly, embraced me, and said, "Papa, give me something to eat." The other case concerns a young maidservant who complained that people pursued her with electricity, and that this caused a queer feeling in her genitals, as if it ate and drank down there. These regressive phenomena show that even from the distance of the modern mind, those early stages of the libido can be regressively reached. One may assume, therefore, that in the earliest states of human development, this road was much more easily traveled than it is today. It becomes then a matter of great interest to learn whether traces of this have been preserved in history. We owe our knowledge of the ethnologic fantasy of boring to the valuable work of Abraham, who also refers us to the writings of Adalbert Kuhn. Through this investigation, we learn that Prometheus, the fire-bringer, may be a brother of the Hindu Pramantha, that is to say, of the masculine fire-rubbing piece of wood. The Hindu fire-bringer is called Matarikvan, and the activity of the fire preparation is always designated in the hieratic text by the verb manthami, which means shaking, rubbing, bringing forth by rubbing. Kuhn has put this verb in connection with the Greek pantheos, which means to learn, and has explained this conceptual relationship. The tertium comparationis might lie in the rhythm, the movement to and fro in the mind. According to Kuhn, the root manth or moth must be traced from the Greek learn, that which is learned, knowledge, the act of learning, to take thought beforehand, to Prometheus, forethought, who is the Greek fire-robber, through an unauthorized Sanskrit word, Prometheus, which comes by way of Pramantha, and which possesses the double meaning of rubber and robber. The transition to Prometheus was effected. With that, however, the prefix pra caused special difficulties, so that the whole derivation was doubted by a series of authors, and was held in part as erroneous. On the other hand, it was pointed out that as the Thuric Zeus bore the especially interesting cognomen Prometheus, thus Prometheus might not be an original Indo-Germanic stem word that was related to the Sanskrit Pramantha, but might represent only a cognomen. This interpretation is supported by a gloss of Hesychius, Prometheus, the herald of the Titans. Another gloss of Hesychius explains other Greek terms, meaning of the flaming one, analogous to similar Greek words. The relation of Prometheus to Pramantha could scarcely be so direct as Kuhn conjectures. The question of an indirect relation is not decided with that. Above all, Prometheus is of great significance as a surname for Atheos, since the flaming one is the forethinker. Pramati equals precaution, is also an attribute of Agni, although Pramati is of another derivation. Prometheus, however, belongs to the line of Phlegians, which was placed by Kuhn in uncontested relationship to the Indian priest family of Burgu. The Burgu are like Matarikvan, the one swelling in the mother, also fire-bringers. Kuhn quotes a passage according to which Burgu also arises from the flame like Agni. In the flame Burgu originated, Burgu roasted but did not burn. This view leads to a root related to burgu, that is to say, to the Sanskrit bre, equal to light, Latin fulgio, and Greek thegio, Sanskrit burgus, equals splendor, Latin fulgur. Burgu appears therefore as the shining one. Vanes means a certain species of eagle on account of its burnished gold color. The connection with Valius, which signifies to burn, is clear. The Phlegians are also the fire eagles. Prometheus also belongs to the Phlegians. The path from Pramantha to Prometheus passes not through the word, but through the idea, and therefore we should adopt this same meaning for Prometheus as that which Pramantha attains from the Hindu fire symbolism. The Pramantha, as the tool of Manthana, the fire sacrifice, is considered purely sexual in the Hindu. The Pramantha as phallus or man, the bored wood underneath as vulva or woman. The resulting fire is the child, the divine son Agni. The two pieces of wood are called in the cult Pururavas and Urvachi, and were thought of personified as men and women. The fire was born from the genitals of the woman. An especially interesting representation of fire production as a religious ceremony, Manthana, is given by Weber. A certain sacrificial fire was lit by the rubbing together of two sticks. One piece of wood is taken up with the words, "Thou art the birthplace of the fire," and two blades of grass are placed upon it. Ye are the two testicles to the Adhara Rani, the underlying wood. Thou art Urvachi. Then the Uttararani, that which is placed on top, is anointed with butter. Thou art power. This is then placed on the Adhara-rani. Thou art Pururavas, and both are rubbed 3 times. I rub thee with the Gayatrimetrum. I rub thee with the Trishtabhametrum. I rub thee with the Yagatimetrum. The sexual symbolism of this fire production is unmistakable. We see here also the rhythm, the meter, in its original place as sexual rhythm, rising above the mating call into music. A song of the Rig Veda conveys the same interpretation and symbolism. Here is the gear for function, here tinder made ready for the spark. Bring thou the matron, we will rub Agni in ancient fashion forth. In the 2 fire sticks Yata Vedas lieth, even as the well-formed germ in pregnant women. Agni, who day by day must be exalted by men who watch and worship with oblations. Lay this with care on that which lies extended. Straight hath she borne the steer, when made prolific. With his bread pillar, radiant in a splendor, in our skilled task is born the son of Illa. Book 3, 29, 1-3. Side by side with the unequivocal coitus symbolism, we see that the Pramantha is also Agni, the created sun. The phallus is the sun, or the sun is the phallus. Therefore Agni, in the Vedic mythology, has the threefold character. With this we are once more connected with the above-mentioned Kabiric father-son cult. In the modern German language we have preserved echoes of the primitive symbols. A boy is designated as Bengal, short, thick piece of wood; in Hessian as Stift or Bolzen, arrow, wooden peg or stump. The Artemisia abrotanum, which is called in German Stabwurz, stick root, is called in English boy's love. The vulgar designation of the penis as boy was remarked even by Grimm and others. The ceremonial production of fire was retained in Europe as late as the 19th century as a superstitious custom. Kuhn mentions such a case even in the year 1828, which occurred in Germany. The solemn magic ceremony was called the Nod fire, the fire of need, and the charm was chiefly used against cattle epidemics. Kuhn cites from the Chronicle of Lannerkost of the year 1268 an especially noteworthy case of the Nod fire, the ceremonies of which plainly reveal the fundamental phallic meaning. In Latin, instead of preserving the divine faith in its purity, the reader will call to mind the fact that in this year, when the plague, usually called lung sickness, attacked the herds of cattle in Laedonia, certain bestial men, monks in dress but not in spirit, taught the ignorant people of their country to make fire by rubbing wood together, and to set up a statue of Priapus, and by that method to succor the cattle. After a Cistercian lay brother had done this near Fentone In front of the entrance of the court he sprinkled the animals with holy water and with the preserved testicles of a dog, etc. These examples, which allow us to recognize a clear sexual symbolism in the generation of fire, prove, therefore, since they originate from different times and different peoples, the existence of a universal tendency to credit to fire production not only a magical but also a sexual significance. This ceremonial or magic repetition of this very ancient, long outlived observance shows how insistently the human mind clings to the old forms, and how deeply rooted is this very ancient reminiscence of fire boring. One might almost be inclined to see in the sexual symbolism of fire production a relatively late addition to the priestly lore. This may indeed be true for the ceremonial elaboration of the fire mysteries, but whether originally the generation of fire was in general a sexual action, that is to say, a coitus play, is still a question. That similar things occur among very primitive people we learn from the Australian tribe of the Washandies, who in the spring perform the following magic ceremonies of fertilization. They dig a hole in the ground, so formed and surrounded with bushes as to counterfeit a woman's genitals. They dance the night long around this hole. In connection with this, they hold spears in front of themselves in a manner to recall the penis in erection. They dance around the hole and thrust their spears into the ditch, while they cry to it, Puli niri Wataka, non fasa, sed kunis. Such obscene dances appear among other primitive races as well. In this spring incantation are contained the elements of the coitus play. This play is nothing but a coitus game, that is to say, originally this play was simply a coitus in the form of sacramental mating, which for a long time was a mysterious element among certain cults, and reappeared in sects. In the ceremonies of Zinzendorf's followers, echoes of the coitus sacrament may be recognized, also in other sects. One can easily think that just as the above-mentioned Australian Bushmen performed the coitus play in this manner, the same performance could be enacted in another manner, and indeed in the form of fire production. Instead of through two selected human beings, the coitus was represented by two substitutes, by Pururavas and Urvachi, by phallus and vulva, by borer and opening. Just as the primitive thought behind other customs is really the sacramental coition, so here the primal tendency is really the act itself. For the act of fertilization is the climax, the true festival of life, and well worthy to become the nucleus of a religious mystery. If we are justified in concluding that the symbolism of the hole in the earth used by the Watshandis for the fertilization of the earth takes the place of the coitus, then the generation of fire could be considered in the same way as a substitute for coitus, and indeed it might be further concluded as a consequence of this reasoning that the invention of fire making is also due to the need of supplying a symbol for the sexual act. Let us return for a moment to the infantile symptom of boring. Let us imagine a strong adult man carrying on the boring with two pieces of wood with the same perseverance and the energy corresponding to that of this child. He may very easily create fire by this play, but of greatest significance in this work is the rhythm. This hypothesis seems to me psychologically possible, although it should not be said with this that only in this way could the discovery of fire occur. It could result just as well by the striking together of flints. It is scarcely possible that fire was created in only one way. All I want to establish here is merely the psychologic process, the symbolic indications of which point to the possibility that in such a way was fire invented or prepared. The existence of the primitive coitus play or rite seems to me sufficiently proven. The only thing that is obscure is the energy and emphasis of the ritual play. It is well known that those primitive rites were often of very bloody seriousness and were performed with an extraordinary display of energy, which appears as a great contrast to the well-known indolence of primitive humanity. Therefore the ritual activity entirely loses the character of play, and wins that of purposeful effort. If certain Negro races can dance the whole night long to three tones in the most monotonous manner, then according to our idea there is in this an absolute lack of the character of play pastime. It approaches nearer to exercise. There seems to exist a sort of compulsion to transfer the libido into such ritual activity. If the basis of the ritual activity is the sexual act, we may assume that it is really the underlying thought and object of the exercise. Under these circumstances, the question arises why the primitive man endeavors to represent the sexual act symbolically and with effort, or if this wording appears to be too hypothetical, why does he exert energy to such a degree only to accomplish practically useless things which apparently do not especially amuse him? It may be assumed that the sexual act is more desirable to a primitive man than such absurd and moreover fatiguing exercises. It is hardly possible but that a certain compulsion conducts the energy away from the original object and real purpose, inducing the production of surrogates. The existence of a phallic or orgiastic cult does not indicate eo ipso a particularly lascivious life, any more than the ascetic symbolism of Christianity means an especially moral life. One honors that which one does not possess, or that which one is not. This compulsion, to speak in the nomenclature formulated above, removes a certain amount of libido from the real sexual activity and creates a symbolic and practically valid substitute for what is lost. This psychology is confirmed by the above-mentioned Wat's Chandi ceremony. During the entire ceremony, none of the men may look at a woman. This detail again informs us from whence the libido is to be diverted. But this gives rise to the pressing question, whence comes this compulsion? We have already suggested above that the primitive sexuality encounters a resistance which leads to a side-tracking of the libido onto substitution actions, analogy, symbolism, etc. It is unthinkable that it is a question of any outer opposition whatsoever, or of a real obstacle, since it occurs to no savage to catch his elusive quarry with ritual charms, but it is a question of an internal resistance. Will opposes will, libido opposes libido, since a psychologic resistance as an energic phenomenon corresponds to a certain amount of libido. The psychologic compulsion for the transformation of the libido is based on an original division of the will. I will return to this primal splitting of the libido in another place. Here let us concern ourselves only with the problem of the transition of the libido. The transition takes place, as has been repeatedly suggested, by means of shifting to an analogy. The libido is taken away from its proper place and transferred to another substratum. The resistance against sexuality aims, therefore, at preventing the sexual act. It also seeks to crowd the libido away from the sexual function. We see, for example, in hysteria, how the specific repression blocks the real path of transference. Therefore, the libido is obliged to take another path, and that an earlier one, namely, the incestuous road, which ultimately leads to the parents. Let us speak, however, of the incest prohibition, which hindered the very first sexual transference. Then the situation changes in so far that no earlier way of transference is left except that of the pre-sexual stage of development, where the libido was still partly in the function of nutrition. By a regression to the pre-sexual material, the libido becomes quasi-desexualized, but as the incest prohibition signifies only a temporary and conditional restriction of the sexuality, thus only that part of the libido which is best designated as the incestuous component is now pushed back to the pre-sexual stage. The repression, therefore, concerns only that part of the sexual libido which wishes to fix itself permanently upon the parents. The sexual libido is only withdrawn from the incestuous component, repressed upon the pre-sexual stage, and there, if the operation is successful, desexualized, by which this amount of libido is prepared for an asexual application. However, it is to be assumed that this operation is accomplished only with difficulty, because the incestuous libido, so to speak, must be artificially separated from the sexual libido, with which for ages through the whole animal kingdom it was indistinguishably united. The regression of the incestuous component must therefore take place not only with great difficulty, but also carry with it into the pre-sexual stage a considerable sexual character. The consequence of this is that the resulting phenomena, although stamped with the character of the sexual act, are nevertheless not really sexual acts de facto. They are derived from the pre-sexual stage, and are maintained by the repressed sexual libido, therefore possess a double significance. Thus the fire-boring is a coitus, and to be sure an incestuous one, but a desexualized one, which has lost its immediate sexual worth, and is therefore indirectly useful to the propagation of the species. The pre-sexual stage is characterized by countless possibilities of application, because the libido has not yet formed definite localizations. It therefore appears intelligible that an amount of libido which reaches this stage through regression is confronted with manifold possibilities of application. Above all, it is met with the possibility of a purely onanistic activity. But as the matter in question, in the regressive component of libido, is sexual libido, the ultimate object of which is propagation, therefore it goes to the external object, parents. It will also introvert, with this destination as its essential character. The result, therefore, is that the purely onanistic activity turns out to be insufficient, and another object must be sought for, which takes the place of the incest object. The nurturing Mother Earth represents the ideal example of such an object. The psychology of the presexual stage contributes the nutrition component, the sexual libido, the coitus idea. From this the ancient symbols of agriculture arise. In the work of agriculture, hunger and incest intermingle. The ancient cults of Mother Earth and all the superstitions founded thereon saw in the cultivation of earth the fertilization of the mother. The aim of the action is desexualized, however, for it is the fruit of the field and the nourishment contained therein. The regression resulting from the incest prohibition leads, in this case, to the new valuation of the mother, this time, however, not as a sexual object, but as a nourisher. The discovery of fire seems to be due to a very similar regression to the pre-sexual stage, more particularly to the nearest stage of the displaced rhythmic manifestation. The libido, introverted from the incest prohibition, with the more detailed designation of the motor components of coitus, when it reaches the pre-sexual stage, meets the related infantile boring, to which it now gives, in accordance with its realistic destination, an actual material. Therefore the material is fittingly called materia, as the object is the mother, as above. As I sought to show above, the action of the infantile boring requires only the strength and perseverance of an adult man and suitable material in order to generate fire. If this is so, it may be expected that, analogous to our foregoing case of onanistic boring, the generation of fire originally occurred as such an act of quasi-onanistic activity, objectively expressed. The demonstration of this can never be actually furnished, but it is thinkable that somewhere traces of this original onanistic preliminary exercise of fire production have been preserved. I have succeeded in finding a passage in a very old monument of Hindu literature which contains this transition of the sexual libido through the onanistic phase in the preparation of fire. This passage is found in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. In truth, he, Atman, was as large as a woman and a man when they embrace each other. This, his own self, he divided into two parts, out of which husband and wife were formed. With her he copulated. From this humanity sprang. She, however, pondered, how may he unite with me after he has created me from himself? Now I shall hide. Then she became a cow. He, however, became a bull, and mated with her. From that sprang the horned cattle. Then she became a mare. He, however, became a stallion. She became a she-ass, he an ass, and mated with her. From these sprang the whole-hoofed animals. She became a goat. He became a buck. She became a ewe. He became a ram, and mated with her. Thus were created goats and sheep. Thus it happened that all that mates, even down to the ants, he created. Then he perceived, truly I myself am creation, for I have created the whole world. Thereupon he rubbed his hands so before the mouth, so that he brought forth fire from his mouth, as from the mother womb, and from his hands. We meet here a peculiar myth of creation, which requires a psychologic interpretation. In the beginning, the libido was undifferentiated and bisexual. This was followed by differentiation into a male and a female component. From then on, man knows what he is. Now follows a gap in the coherence of the thought, where belongs that very resistance which we have postulated above for the explanation of the urge for sublimation. Next follows the onanistic act of rubbing or boring, here finger sucking, transferred from the sexual zone, from which proceeds the production of fire. The libido here leaves its characteristic manifestation as sexual function and regresses to the presexual stage, where, in conformity with the above explanation, it occupies one of the preliminary stages of sexuality, thereby producing, in the view expressed in the Upanishad, the first human art, and from there, as suggested by Kuhn's idea of the root month, perhaps the higher intellectual activity in general. This course of development is not strange to the psychiatrist, for it is a well-known psychopathological fact that onanism and excessive activity of fantasy are very closely related. The sexualizing, autonomizing of the mind through autoerotism is so familiar a fact that examples of that are superfluous. The course of the libido, as we may conclude from these studies, originally proceeded in a similar manner as in the child, only in a reversed sequence. The sexual act was pushed out of its proper zone and was transferred into the analogous mouth zone, the mouth receiving the significance of the female genitals, the hand and the fingers respectively receiving the phallic meaning. In this manner, the regressively reoccupied activity of the presexual stage is invested with the sexual significance, which indeed it already possessed in part before, but in a wholly different sense. Certain functions of the presexual stage are found to be permanently suitable, and therefore are retained later on as sexual functions. Thus, for example, the mouth zone is retained as of erotic importance, meaning that its valuation is permanently fixed. Concerning the mouth, we know that it also has a sexual meaning among animals, inasmuch as, for example, stallions bite mares in the sexual act, also cats, cocks, etc. A second significance of the mouth is as an instrument of speech. It serves essentially in the production of the mating call, which mostly represents the developed tones of the animal kingdom. As to the hand, we know that it has the important significance of the contractation organ. For example, among frogs, the frequent erotic use of the hand among monkeys is well known. If there exists a resistance against the real sexuality, then the accumulated libido is most likely to cause a hyperfunction of those collaterals which are most adapted to compensate for the resistance, that is to say, the nearest functions which serve for the introduction of the act. On one side the function of the hand, on the other that of the mouth. The sexual act, however, against which the opposition is directed, is replaced by a similar act of the presexual stage, the classic case being either finger sucking or boring. Just as among apes the foot can on occasions take the place of the hand, so the child is often uncertain in the choice of the object to suck, and puts the big toe in the mouth instead of the finger. This last movement belongs to a Hindu rite, only the big toe was not put in the mouth, but held against the eye. Through the sexual significance of the hand and mouth, these organs, which in the presexual stage serve to obtain pleasure, are invested with procreating power, which is identical with the above-mentioned destination, which aims at the external object because it concerns the sexual or creating libido. When through the actual preparation of fire, the sexual character of the libido employed in that is fulfilled, then the mouth zone remains without adequate expression. Only the hand has now reached its real, purely human goal in its first art. The mouth has, as we saw, a further important function which has just as much sexual relation to the object as the hand, that is to say, the production of the mating call. In opening up the autoerotic ring, hand-mouth, where the phallic hand became the fire-producing tool, the libido, which was directed to the mouth zone, was obliged to seek another path of functioning, which naturally was found in the already existing love call. The excess of libido entering here must have had the usual results, namely the stimulation of the newly possessed function, hence an elaboration of the mating call. We know that from the primitive sounds human speech has developed. Corresponding to the psychological situation, it might be assumed that language owes its real origin to this moment, when the impulse, repressed into the presexual stage, turns to the external in order to find an equivalent object there. The real thought as a conscious activity is, as we saw in the first part of this book, a thinking with positive determination towards the external world, that is to say, a speech thinking. This sort of thinking seems to have originated at that moment. It is very remarkable that this view, which was won by the path of reasoning, is again supported by old tradition and other mythological fragments. End of section 13.